It's that moment when everyone leaves me at the front here and I stand here alone. How many of you have flown in an aeroplane? Yeah, fairly common, eh? I just want to share with you a couple of experiences I've had flying in an aeroplane, things that have stuck in my mind. I was flying into Krakow one Christmas, and you're coming down to land and you could see that it was all snowy, but there was something wrong. The plane was coming in sideways. Everything was white, so you couldn't see much, but it was coming in sideways, and it's one of those things where you think you trust the pilot. You're sure you trust the pilot. Anyway, we landed and most of the plane clapped. You know, we're all pretty happy with that landing. I had another flight from flying back from Sydney in a United Airlines plane. And I was sitting next to the escape, the emergency exit door, and I specifically asked for that so my long legs could stretch out. But after about half an hour, I noticed there was a cold draft coming in. A third time I was on a plane, and I've listened to Adrian and Jordan preach from up here, and I know you're allowed to mention your wife from the front when you're preaching. We were flying to San Francisco. It's about a 10-hour flight, and we took off and we were cruising away, and then the plane started going up and down. And it went up and down for the entire 10 hours. The turbulence was bad. The smell of vomit was incredibly bad. What was even worse is my wife told me to turn off my screen because it was making her feel worse. 9-10 hours on a plane, eh? I went for a little walk just to alleviate the boredom, and around the corner where the flight stewards do their thing, there was one there with an oxygen mask on. Anyway, as we're coming down to land, the pilot said, "Very sorry for that, I changed altitude and direction and changed speed, but I couldn't stop that. Very sorry." So, flying. The reason I bring these up this morning is because my sermon is on a memorable flight that happened, and I hope to draw some application from that flight to our lives using the Bible. Right, better turn this on, get control. Look at that. The plane that should be still going, but it's not. All right, so let's start, eh? Wilbur, that's him on the left, was the third of 7 children and born in 1867 in Indiana. His brother Orville on the right was the 6th child of 7, and he was born on 1871 in Dayton. None of the Wright children were given middle names. Instead, their father tried to give them special names. Kid number 1 was called Ruchlin, then Lauren, Wilbur, Otis, Ida, Orville, and Catherine was the only, I think, normal name. Because of his father's job as a bishop of the Church of the United Brethren in Christ, the family moved often. In fact, they moved 12 times in 7 years. Not much is known about whether the Wright brothers actually followed the faith of their father. But it is said that their father, Milton Wright, was drawn to the Church of the United Brethren in Christ largely because of its stand on such political and moral issues as slavery, alcohol, and Freemasonry, rather than its theology. Neither Orville nor Wilbur graduated from high school. Wilbur was an excellent student. His grades were all in the 90s, and he was an excellent athlete. There was talk of him going to Yale, but they shifted in his final year, and he never got to complete. He completed 95% of the requirements, but it wasn't enough. Interestingly, the diploma was awarded to him in 1994. Even worse, in the winter of the 1844-85 winter, the Wilbur was playing ice hockey and was hit in the mouth with a hockey stick, knocking out most of his front teeth. Excruciating pain, false teeth, digestive problems led to depression. For 3 years, Wilbur became a recluse, largely housebound. During this time, he took care of his mother, who was dying of tuberculosis. His father said that Wilbur lengthened his mother's life by 2 years. Lesson number 1. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. Throughout the Bible, there are a number of stories about godly, influential men and women who struggled and battled through dark times and hopelessness and depression. David, Jonah, Job, Moses, Jeremiah, and Elijah all said things like, "I have had enough, Lord. Take my life. I am not better than my ancestors." Even Jesus himself was deeply anguished over what lay before him. In the garden, Jesus prayed all alone, calling out to his Father, "My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but you will." Mark 14:34-36. We can be assured that in whatever we face, Jesus understands our weakness and suffering, our greatest times of temptation and despair, because he too has travelled that road. What's true about all these stories and many others is God was with them, close and near. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. He was there in the good days and the dark days too. He didn't condemn them for their questions and pain. He didn't tell them to just tough it out. He reached down to their darkest pit of suffering and lifted them out. He cared. He showed compassion. He offered mercy. He brought hope. He instilled purpose. And he still works the same way today. Our world desperately needs joy givers, hope bringers, people in our lives who will help us remember what real grace is and where lasting help is found. The greatest truth is this: we have a Saviour who understands our pain and knows about every weakness and hurt and reaches out with compassion. He is healer, redeemer, restorer, and friend. In Romans it says, "And we know that all things work together for good to those who love the Lord, to those who are called according to his purpose." In the Desire of Ages it says, "God never leads his children otherwise than they would choose to be led. If they could see the end from the beginning and discern the glory of his purpose, which they are fulfilling as co-workers with him." Lesson number 2, get help. Depression is common, yet very treatable. It affects many people in the world. Statistics tell us that only about 1/3 of those who are depressed actually receive treatment. But 80 to 90% of those who do seek treatment report feeling better within a few weeks. Help is available. Don't feel the need to try and hide your pain or struggle through your own. Talk to a friend. Seek professional treatment. Orville was only 15 when his family moved back to Dayton. Orville found that his neighbour was running a small printing press, so they became partners and started the business. At first they wrote and printed newspapers, the West Side News, the Dayton Tatler. Soon they discovered it was more profitable to do printing jobs for businesses. When they needed a bigger press, Orville and Wilbur built one out of a damaged tombstone, buggy parts, and other odds and ends. There it is. In 1889, Orville dropped out of school in his junior year to work full-time in his printing business. He had become the sole owner. A grocery store paid their bill in popcorn. Orville's partner wanted to eat the popcorn. Orville wanted to sell it and invest it. So Orville sold his share of the popcorn to his partner in exchange for his partner's shares in the business. In time, the business grew to pay each brother about $500 a year. But they moved on. In 1887, Wilbur and Orville purchased their first bicycles. Wilbur preferred long country rides, while Orville enjoyed racing and considered himself a scorcher on the racetrack. Knowing their mechanical ability, many friends asked them to repair their bicycles. In 1893, at the ages of 26 and 22, Wilbur and Orville opened their own bicycle repair shop and expanded in sales. In 1895, they began manufacturing their own line of bikes in a machine shop above the showroom. The Van Cleve, that's it there on the screen, had two new features, an oil-retaining wheel hub and coaster brakes. By 1895, they were making 300 bikes a year and earning $3,000 a year. Lesson number 3, invest in eternal things. The brother's partner sold his share in the printing press for popcorn, which tasted good at the time, but was soon gone. The brothers kept their investment and it paid them well, but even that money is now gone. The Bible tells us to lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. A portion of our time and resources needs to go to provide food, clothes, shelter and education. A portion also needs to be invested in something of eternal value. Give an offering. Someone could be in the kingdom because of a missionary you paid for. Take time to nurture your children. They may be in the kingdom because you did. Teach a pathfinder honour. A pathfinder may be in the kingdom because you did. Help your neighbour. Lesson number 4. Small things prepare you for big things. Although they did not know it, the brothers work as bike mechanics and builders helped prepare them to balance and build aeroplanes. How could they know that learning to balance a bike would help them learn to balance an aeroplane? How could they know that learning to build a bike would help them build an aeroplane? He who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much, and he who is unjust in what is least is unjust also in much. Moses and David had to be faithful in herding sheep before they could lead God's people. Joseph had to be faithful as a slave before he could be Prime Minister of Egypt. Samuel had to do menial chores in the temple before he could be a prophet. Perhaps the small job God has called you to now is preparing you for a big job later. There are no small parts, only small actors. Wax on, wax off. In the late summer of 1886, Orville was struck with dreaded typhoid. He was bedridden for 6 weeks. During this time, Wilbur began reading about the German glider enthusiast, Otto Lilienthal. Lilienthal had built a primitive hand glider. He became famous the world over when he had himself photographed and appeared in newspapers. Sadly, the only way to control the glider was by shifting his weight. In August of 1896, Lilienthal crashed from 20 metres and died. News of his death, Wilbur later wrote, aroused in him as nothing had an interest that had remained passive since youth. He and Orville began an intense study of birds in flight. They wrote to the Smithsonian and asked for literature on the subject. By 1899, they had decided they would design and build their own glider. Their emphasis would be on developing a system to control the glider and the skill to keep it in flight. They decided that experiencing gliding would be necessary. Wilbur had calculated that in the 5 years Lilienthal devoted to gliding, only 5 hours had been spent in flight. It was not enough. Lesson 5. Jesus' sacrifice compels us. Just as Lilienthal's death compelled Wilbur to learn to fly, Christ's love compels us to follow Jesus wherever he leads. Because we are convinced that one died for all and therefore all died, and he died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them and was raised again. We do not serve a God out of fear. We do not serve a God in hopes of earthly reward or protection. We do not earn our way to heaven through good works. We do not improve ourselves through good works. Because Jesus gave all for me, I will give whatever he asks for me. We look at what Jesus has and is doing for us and serve him out of love. Lesson number 6 is we must experience Jesus. Just as Lilienthal knowing about flight was not the same as actually flying, knowing about Jesus is not enough. Even the devils know about Jesus. And this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. We must do more than know about Jesus. We must experience him. But how? How do you experience riding a bike? You ride the bike. Sometimes you fall off. Sometimes you get back on. It's the same with experiencing God. Listen to his voice in the Bible. Listen to his voice in others, in the beauty of nature and in books and sermons. Listen for his voice and then follow it. Try something small at first. As you grow, you will recognize God's voice with more certainty. The more you practice, the better you get. In the summer of 1899, in the room above their bike shop, they began their first kite, a biplane made of bamboo and paper with a 5-foot wingspan. Wilbur had noticed that when birds turn, they change the angle of one wing. The wing that meets the wind at a greater angle produces more lift on that side, and the bird turns. Their kite had wings that could be twisted or warped by the operator. In early August, they tested the kite. The wing warping did cause a turn, but the turn was so sharp that the kite crashed. To the Wrights, this was proof that wing warping worked, and they were ready to build a man-sized glider. By late August 1900, they had constructed the Wright Glider 1. At 5.5 metres, the glider was made of pine. Spruce and ash were not available. It was covered with sateen, weighing about 23 kilograms. It included a new control device, an elevator, we would call it the tail of the plane. The Wright glider had the tail in the front of the plane. It prevented dives and cushioned crashes. They wanted to test it at a place where reliable winds and sand for soft landings. The Weather Bureau recommended Kitty Hawk. After a 2-day train ride, Wilbur arrived at Elizabeth City, a coastal city about 80 kilometres from Kitty Hawk. It took him 4 hours to find a boat owner who had heard of Kitty Hawk. When Wilbur arrived at Kitty Hawk, he asked the Tate family if he could board with them until his brother arrived and they could build a shelter. The Tates stepped into their bedroom to discuss it, but they did not close the door. They were concerned their humble home wouldn't be enough for such a finely dressed gentleman. Wilbur convinced them otherwise, and they accepted. It was the beginning of a friendship that would last decades. First, they tested their kite. The Wright Glider 1 was a kite controlled from the ground. When Wilbur lay on it and flew it, while Orville and Bill Tate ran along under it with ropes tied to it to keep it from flying too high. Eventually, Wilbur glided 120 metres. They ended up giving that glider to the Tates. Mrs. Tate used the fabric to sew dresses for her daughters. Lesson number 7. Kitty Hawk will be famous. In 1900, people living 80 kilometres away from Kitty Hawk had never heard of it. Now it's world famous. Why? Because of what happened there. Orville and Wilbur made it famous. Tourists travel there and say, this is where the first flight was. And books were opened and the dead were judged according to their works, by the things which are written in them. Can you imagine it? Up in heaven, watching Earth's history on a giant screen or hologram to see that God has been just. They zero in on Whangarei. It was right here where many of you helped out with seminars, CHIP program, free clothing, Sabbath school, adventurers and pathfinders, Bible studies. Or maybe it was just a simple chat you had in the foyer or at church lunch. Someone will be in the kingdom because of that. Also, hospitality is important. If the Tate family had never accepted those 2 young men into their home, they would have been lost to history. Hospitality can be defined as treating guests and strangers in a warm, friendly, generous way. Do not forget to entertain strangers, for by doing so, some have unwittingly entertained angels. Hospitality is a virtue that is both commanded and commended through Scripture. In the Old Testament, it was specifically commanded by God. When an alien lives with you in your land, do not mistreat them. During his public ministry, Jesus and his disciples depended entirely on the hospitality of others as they ministered from town to town. As followers of Christ, we emulate his love and compassion when we show hospitality, not only to fellow Christians, but even more so to strangers and less fortunate. In fact, we honour God when we are kind to the needy. Whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will reward them for what they have done. When you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Christ also taught us the second greatest commandment, to love your neighbour as yourself. And the parable of the Good Samaritan teaches us that neighbour has nothing to do with geography, citizenship, or race. Whoever and whenever people need us, there can be neighbours, and like Christ, show mercy. This is the essence of hospitality. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus discusses the hospitable behaviour of those who will inherit the kingdom. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. Matthew 25:34-36. In these days, we often don't think much about entertaining strangers, but hospitality is still an important part of the Christian ministry. By serving others, we serve Christ, and we promote the spread of gospel truth. The Wrights returned to Kitty Hawk in 1901 with the Wright Glider 2. It was a similar design with twice the wing area, wings with greater curvature and covered in muslin instead of sateen. It was not as stable as the Wright Glider 1 and did not provide the lift predicted by equations. The Wrights returned to Dayton and constructed the first wind tunnel to test the lift of 200 different wing designs. They discovered the optimal wing curvature and proper lift elevation values. The Wrights returned to Kitty Hawk in September of 1902 with the Wright Glider 3, with longer, 10 metre wide instead of 6, narrower, 3 metres instead of 4, and less curvature wings, and a horizontal rudder with a total weight of 50 kilograms. The Wrights made between 700 and 1,000 well-controlled glides of up to 200 metres. They had discovered the way to control flight. They could soar, they could float. They could dive and rise. They could circle and land, all with assurance. Aviation experts say this was more important than adding power. It is pretty much how aeroplanes are still controlled today and was the basis of the Wrights' 1903 patent. Lesson number 9, find the truth for yourself. Observation is truth for scientists. If observation does not agree with theory, observation is correct. The Bible is the truth for Christians. If expert theory does not agree with the Bible is correct. Don't trust the experts, be like the Bereans. In Acts 17 says, they, the Bereans, received the word with all readiness and searched the scripture daily to find out whether these things were so. The Bereans heard the teaching of the most famous apostle and theologian of the early church, and the human author of many New Testament books, yet they searched scriptures when Paul taught to see if his teaching was truly biblical. They would not accept Paul's teaching without checking for themselves, so they could know if these things were so. When the Bereans heard Paul teach, their reaction wasn't, oh, he's a fine speaker, or I don't like the way he talks, or what a funny preacher that is. Instead, the Bereans wanted to know, are these things so? Does this man teach the truth? We must search the scriptures daily to find out whether these things are so. The other point is they searched the scriptures daily to find out. It wasn't a one-time quick look. They made it a point of diligent, extended study. For them, the Bible was not just a pretty book of poetry or mystery or nice spiritual inspiration for thoughts for the day. It was a book of truth, and that truth was there to find out. But with all their diligent searching and concern for the truth, the Bereans did not become skeptics. They received the word with all readiness. When Paul preached, they were open-hearted and had clear minds. Many people have clear heads but closed hearts, and never receive the word with all readiness. It was both of these things that made the Bereans more fair-minded than those in Thessalonica. We believe we have the truth, but let's not be arrogant about it. There may be more truth God has not revealed yet. Be patient when telling others about the truth. People need time to process. In early 1983, the Wrights calculated an 8-horsepower motor weighing less than 90 kilograms would produce enough thrust to provide the necessary lift. Just think about that. A chainsaw, 3 horsepower, a ride-on lawnmower, 20 horsepower, and they don't weigh anywhere near 90 kilograms. They wrote to engineer manufacturers asking for off-the-counter models, but none existed, so they asked their bike mechanic, Charlie Taylor, to construct one. The work of boring out the aluminium for the cylinders was done by one man with a drooping walrus moustache in the back of a bike shop on the same lathe and drill press used for building bikes. It was a very crude motor, It had no carburetor, no spark plugs, and no radiator. The first one took 6 weeks to build. On its first trial, it seized up and cracked. So another was built, which worked fine. The Wrights thought it would be easy to design propellers based on boat propellers, but found there was no real science on the matter. So they tested many of their own in a wind tunnel. The actual propellers on their final design were 2 metres in diameter and were hand carved with hatchet and draw knife. The linkage between the motor and the propellers was, of course, a bike chain. To carry the extra weight of the motor, the Wright Flyer 1 wings had more surface area. The frame was made of ash and covered with Pride of the West muslin cloth. It was too heavy to be hand-launched like the gliders, so a launching track was built. The Flyer rolled down the track on a wagon until it reached speed sufficient to create the desired lift. On December 14, 1903, the Wrights were ready for their first test. Wilbur won the coin toss. The Flyer left the track, but Wilbur pulled up too sharply, stalled, and came down 3.5 seconds later. The brothers were elated. Everything had worked perfectly except for operator error, which could be fixed with practice. The men carried the 600-pound plane to the launching track. The men became serious. Orville and Wilbur shook hands as if saying goodbye. Then Orville got on the plane. At exactly 10:35, Orville pulled the rope and the Flyer began gliding down the track. Wilbur ran alongside, balancing the Flyer. At the end of the track, the Flyer lifted, and one of the men from the life-saving station, who had never used a camera before, snapped one of the most famous pictures of the 20th century. The flight was very erratic, up and down like a bucking bronco, until one wing hit the sand. It lasted only 12 seconds and covered only 36 metres. But it was a real flight. The brothers made 3 more flights that day. One was 53 metres, another 60 metres, and finally 260 metres. The last landing broke the front elevator. The brothers hoped to repair it, but as they were examining it, a gust of wind grabbed the Flyer and tossed it, and a bystander, that's the first person to survive a plane accident, across the sand as if they weighed nothing. The guy was unharmed, but the Flyer was broken beyond repair. They packed it up and took it home. Wilbur telegraphed his father of the successful flight, and Wilbur's sister gave the telegraph to the local newspaper. They printed the story. What did they print? The Wright brothers will be home for Christmas. After 1909, Wilbur gave up flying and concentrated on business and legal activities, including numerous lawsuits filed against rival aviation builders. The brothers felt it infringed on their patent rights. Though courts in France and the United States held up the Wright brothers' positions in nearly every case, the defendants were able to avoid making any substantial payments. Exhausted from his efforts and battling typhoid fever, Wilbur died in 1912 at the age of 45. Orville assumed leadership of the Wright Company but ended up selling it in 1915 to a group of financiers. He established his own Wright Aeronautical Library, seeking to concentrate on scientific research, but also devoted himself to defending his and his brother's reputation as the inventors of the aeroplane. Orville died in 1948. Possibly the best claim to successful powered and controlled flight before the Wright brothers comes from New Zealand. Richard Pearce of Temuka worked on the problem of powered flight beginning in 1899 and developed an aircraft that quite resembled a modern ultralight. Pearce would have beaten the Wrights by 8 months if he hadn't crashed at the end of his 140-metre flight in 1903. Or maybe it was the lack of photographs, logs or written records of the flight. The few eyewitnesses couldn't agree on the length of the flight or even the exact date. Since the landing wasn't really any rougher than the Wrights' landing during that first flight at Kill Devil Hills, the lack of documentation was probably what kept Pearce out of most history books. Lesson number 10. Everyone has a part to play. Could the Wrights have built the first plane without Charlie Taylor? Maybe, but it would have taken longer. Can the church accomplish its mission without you? It can, but not as efficiently. In 1 Corinthians 12, Paul uses the brilliant illustration of the human body to relate the working of the community of Christians. Even as every cell in the human body is linked by a common root, a common DNA code, yet the parts of the body, members, look different and are treated differently, work differently, and accomplish different purposes. Even so, there is great diversity in the body of Jesus Christ, both in appearance and function, yet each member has a common root and a common goal. Some parts of the body and the church may seem more important than others, but if one part is missing, the whole body suffers. The body does not argue with itself, neither should the church. Since everyone's gifts are important, we should care for each other so that gifts are not lost. When one member suffers, we all suffer. When one member is honoured, we are all honoured. Lesson 11, are you listening? Are you like the men at the life-saving station who missed the world's first flight? Or the Dayton newspaper that missed the biggest story of the decade? Or Bill Tate, who was away on business? In John 10:27 it says, "My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." God had to speak to a 7-year-old Samuel because Eli was not listening. God spoke to Elijah in a still small voice. If you heard a bunch of shepherds running through the city at midnight shouting, "The Messiah is born," would you get up and follow them? Are you listening for that voice today? Are you willing to follow it? God engineers circumstances to see what we will do. Will we be the children of our Father in heaven, or will we go back to that meaner common sense attitude? Will we stake all and stand true to him? Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. The crown of life means I shall see that my Lord has got the victory after all, even in me. Oswald Chambers, The Pilgrim Songbook. Lesson 12, we are being transformed. 66 years after that first flight, the Apollo 11 mission flew to the moon, landed, and returned to Earth. What a transformation had occurred in those 66 years, yet that transformation pales in comparison to the transformation each of us is undergoing. But we are all being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as by the Spirit of the Lord. From a helpless pawn unable to resist Satan's temptations, we are slowly being sanctified to become like Jesus. Such transformation, ever the result of communion with Christ, there may be marked defects in the character of an individual, yet when he becomes a true disciple of Christ, the power of divine grace transforms and sanctifies him. Beholding as in a glass the glory of the Lord, he is changed from glory to glory until he is like him who he adores. Acts of the Apostles 55. Each astronaut, we know about that one. Each astronaut on Apollo 11 was given a PPK, personal preference kit, a small bag they could put personal items in. Neil Armstrong's PPK was a 66-year-old piece of ash wood measuring 12 millimetres by 30 millimetres by 3 and a 66-year-old piece of muslin cloth. The items in Neil Armstrong's PPK were taken from the left propeller and top left wing of the wrecked Wright Flyer 1. Some of the muslin cloth from that same bolt probably ended up as ladies' dresses or bed sheets. They were worn and worn out and ended up decaying in a landfill, lost to history. The cloth in the PPK ended up in the world's first airplane and went to the moon and back and is still preserved 116 years later. Choose Jesus. Choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. The cloth had no choice, but you do. If you choose Jesus, you can take a round trip farther than the moon. You can go to heaven for 1,000 years and return to earth made new and live forever. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. John 14:6. Our closing hymn today is hymn number, I'm not sure, Standing on the Promises it's called. There it is.